Hello everyone, welcome to another shmup topic video. Today's subject I am very excited to talk about because this is something I've heard on many different occasions, from many different perspectives, on many different forums and discords and Reddit posts and all that sort of thing. This is kind of a common point that people will talk about, but at the same time I've never seen someone really dig into it, sink their teeth into the topic and try and put forward some compelling ideas and arguments. So that is the goal of today's video. And what I'm also really excited about is I've come to what I think is a pretty original conclusion or original idea. And if you don't agree with it, if it's not on your wavelength or it doesn't seem quite right to you, that's totally fine. But I think it's important that people try their best to put out more original ideas and more original content, because I think that can be kind of a struggle these days on YouTube. With my gaming YouTube, for example, it's just really hard because it feels like people are just sort of retreading a lot of water and stuff. So hopefully that's the goal of this video, at the very least, is to bring you something new and original to think about. So let's get into the subject at hand. The question being, of course, what killed arcades? What was the silver bullet to the heart of our favorite genres like shmups, beat 'em ups, to a smaller extent fighting games, so they had their own little revival in the past, kind of here and there. And also with single screen arcade games. I kind of forget about those. I think a lot of people do, like Pac-Man, Mr. Do, Donkey Kong, even though Donkey Kong is known for its drama at this point. How many people actually care about the game? That's debatable. So today's subject, what I'm going to do is I'm not only going to discuss my idea, my sort of final answer or my final framework I'm going to work forward and work on, but I'm also going to go through some of the more common responses and give my critiques and sort of elaborate on them, because I think that'll be pretty fun and also kind of move us forward in the conversation a little bit. So what I did is I created a list here of what I think are the more likely explanations at the end and the more kind of less likely ones at the beginning. I'm not sure of the wording on that, but you'll see what I mean as we go. So the ones that I've heard commonly talked about are 1, fighting games, 2, first-person shooters, 3, the kind of transition to 3D, the N64, PS1 era, that era kind of taking out shmups and arcade games. 4, RPGs, that's a big one with its own sort of history around it. We'll get to that, don't worry. And then the 5th one, consoles themselves being the death of the arcade. And I think I'm going in this order, so the later ones I think are a little bit more along the lines of what I'm thinking, and I'll try my best to kind of explain why I don't fully agree with the earlier ones. And also, before I get into that, I want to give a shout out to one of my patrons, Philip Mason, because on the Patreon I was kind of doing a podcast episode. Check that out if you're interested. Kind of preluding this idea and kind of going through this subject, brainstorming different arguments and stuff like that. And in the comments, Philip Mason gave a really poignant answer, so I wanted to point it out in the video, which is he said, well, the thing to blame is shmups themselves, right? That's a very existential answer, and I appreciate that, for sure. In many ways, that's a very valid response, right? Like, shmups themselves are the reason why they failed. And I can see a lot of strong critiques for that, right? They didn't really innovate and move along with the moves and trends. But what I want to do in this video is I'm going to address this further at the end, is I'm going to try and explain that while shmups could have done some things better, like maybe ramped up their graphics and ramped up different things like tutorials and training modes, having better ports, of course. Like, we kind of look back on a lot of ports with nostalgia, but some of those early ports are really poorly done. Having training modes and stage selects and all those types of things earlier on may have helped. But I'm also going to try and explain that shmups kind of were at a crossroad where if they had changed, I feel like they would have too much. If they changed too much to kind of match the change in direction, I think they would have actually lost their identity and lost what the kind of core, their essence of what makes them shmups, what makes them so intriguing and amazing. Not saying that shmups can't do this, but I'm not generally that displeased with the direction that shmups went. It's a little bit tragic in a way. It's kind of fitting and tragic where shmups were among the very few genres that stuck to their guns, that kept the essence and the philosophy of their game design and just kept pushing it and pushing it. I've talked about this in previous videos where, for instance, like platformers, right? They made Super Mario Bros. And then they made Super Mario Bros. 2, but the Japan version, right? And when they brought the Japan, which is actually harder, more challenging, kind of advancing the gameplay and stuff like that. And the audience was like, whoa, 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 we want to stay kind of static. And so what a lot of genres had to do, like platformers, is they had to kind of move laterally with their game design rather than pushing it and really honing in on the difficulty and the scoring and all that side of things. Shmups didn't do that, really. Shmups didn't make those lateral moves. They just kept moving forward. And so I think that's what makes the genre so compelling and so daunting for people, but also why it's so rewarding to get into. But that'll be my later point. So let's begin with the first candidate, the first suspect of the death of shmups that I've heard, which is fighting games. So the idea behind fighting games being a detrimental force to shmups is that they were direct competitors within the arcade. And there's no doubt that is true. So arcades, shmups were very popular in the 80s, early 90s, the mid 90s and onward. They started to become less and less popular within the arcade, and fighting games showed up and sort of took their place as kings of the arcade. I think that's a very true thing, at least in my experience. If I was really cool, I'd look up like sales data and stuff like that, but just anecdotally and among my peers and stuff, yeah, we moved off of the kind of arcade, like beat 'em ups and single screen stuff, Pac-Man. We moved away from that and started going into playing Tekken, playing Virtua Fighter, playing all that sort of stuff. Those were Street Fighter, of course. That was a much bigger deal within the arcade. However, the reason why I put this on the bottom of the list is because even though the quarters may have shifted within the arcade somewhat, I think that they are too much of a peer group to really blame Street Fighter and those types of things for taking shmups down. The reason for that is, for instance, a lot of my friends would go to the arcades pretty exclusively to play fighting games, my brother, for example, too. But while you're there, it's not like you will only play fighting games, because sometimes you just couldn't because the cabinets were taken up. I had an interview recently with a player that'll come out soon enough where he explained that as well, where, there's Crimson Clover cabinet, there's just one, and so you got to go play other games while you wait. And I remember that happening a lot with fighting games too. And also the thing about fighting games is you may not get all your quarters spent if you're a good player, right? Because you just stay on the machine for a really long time. So I remember, like with Soul Calibur, I went to the arcade, I'd play a bunch of Soul Calibur, and then, I only have so much time there before my parents come pick me up, and I'd have like $4 left, so I'd go and quarter feed the ride-in machine, just to spend that money in a pretty quick and fun manner. And so I think overall, even though they may have taken some of the quarters away within the arcade, they still brought people into the arcades themselves. They were still a force that would help people spend money on shmups. And the central question that we need to ask ourselves with all these different candidates is, if this factor did not exist, would shmups still thrive? And so I think it's pretty safe to say, had fighting games never existed, shmups would have still suffered the fate that they have suffered, because the arcade themselves would have went down. And you could even argue that it is possible fighting games were sort of a subsidiary that helped keep arcades alive longer or relevant longer, and so they may have actually helped shmups in some ways rather than hurting them. So I think that's the least likely candidate for being a problem. And also they're different enough, and they're also very complementary genres, right? Like you play fighting games, head to head, but if you want to play something cooperatively or if you want to play something solo, shmups are right there. And also, running guns and stuff like that, I think they all blend together and complement each other really nicely. And also thinking of stuff like the Neo Geo, right? The Neo Geo was a fighting game powerhouse, but it also had shmups on it, right? Blazing Star, Polestar, stuff like that. So, and then if you count running guns like Metal Slug, I think fighting games really shouldn't be considered too much of a suspect as far as taking down shmups. So that's my first one on the list. The second is first-person shooters. I've actually heard this quite a bit. So the idea with first-person shooters is kind of twofold. The first is that they are not arcade native genre. They are not an arcade native genre, right? They are PC oriented, especially when they're released, like with Doom and that sort of thing. And so they kept people at home. They didn't keep people going to the arcades. And they also kind of have an appeal that's similar to a shmup, right? Where it's very visceral, sort of mastery-based game design, kind of, sometimes, especially like multiplayer and stuff like that. And the essential idea is people who would have played shmups in the past now play FPS. They kind of sliced into the genre and took it over. And while I think a lot of these arguments and perspectives are valid, the big problem is that I don't think they were there when the arcades died. I don't think the PCs, like the collision isn't quite at the timing, right? It's like someone dies and then 4 years later a baby is born and a baby inherits their wealth. You can say, well, that baby benefited from that guy's death. True, but the baby was dead, so I don't think, or the baby wasn't born before the guy died, so he's not really much of a suspect. And I think that's kind of the thing with first-person shooters is, I think long before first-person shooters showed up, the arcades were already kind of doomed, and that's funny. And I don't think the overlap isn't quite there. I don't think, as far as the direct. For instance, my brother plays first-person shooters. Both my brothers are insane FPS fans, and they're actually really, really good at the genre. I don't think, and I remember my older brother, again, we went to the arcades together. He never really had an interest in shmups, but he had a deep interest in FPS. I think that's just a thing where there is some crossover there, but I don't think it's directly leeching the player base. And so I don't think FPS can really be blamed for the death of the arcades and things like that. I think they do benefit from it, and they're sort of ancillary, but I don't think they are a main suspect. I don't think the connection's quite strong enough. The third one is 3D. This is actually pretty interesting. So was 3D the death of arcade? The rationale being is that 3D games don't really translate well to 2D gameplay. 2D gameplay doesn't translate all that well into 3D. Again, when you look at home consoles, this is the argument you can make, right? Like The Legend of Zelda, Mario, Metroid, even with Metroid Prime and stuff. Their 2D gameplay was sort of left on the wayside, and those series kind of died off in that for a while when they made that transition to 3D. A lot of 2D powerhouse genres failed to make that transition into 3D. And so I can see this is a compelling argument. I think there's two problems with 3D being the death of arcades and being the death of shmups. Again, it's kind of like FPS, where I think 3D is a little bit too far away from the kill point to be directly the problem. Also, another issue with 3D is that some genres survived it and other genres did not. And I don't think that's, for instance, the idea that 2D died when 3D came out. I don't think that's quite true, because a lot of 2D based genres still thrived fairly well. The biggest one being, of course, fighting games. Fighting games made the transition, I think, very strong. I think actually the 3D era may have been the strongest point of fighting games. Some people may say Street Fighter 2, maybe that's possible as well, but with Tekken, with Virtua Fighter, and they incorporated the 3D elements into it. And also, I'd say with shmups, you could argue that one of the most famous, popular kind of shmups around, if you want to really think about it this way, is Star Fox 64. Yes, Star Fox 64 is a rail shooter, but the rail shooting genre is a perfect transition from shmups into 3D. It's the perfect transition. It's compelling, it's interesting, it's exciting. I think it even has more mainstream appeal, or did, than 2D shmup. So I don't think that's quite the problem either, because shmups and fighting games in particular, I think, made a very strong transition into 3D. And also beat 'em ups didn't really die out, like Tekken Force, I guess, and stuff like that. And you could also see beat 'em up sort of evolving into character action games like Devil May Cry, that sort of thing. So I don't think the transition to 3D was the nail in the coffin either. And again, I think that's coming a little bit too late. I think the damage was already done by the time 3D games showed up, in my opinion. And again, we have to ask ourselves, if the 3D did not exist, would arcades have survived? I would say no, because again, 3D was actually a pretty big deal for arcades. Think of F-Zero GX, think of the racing games. I think arcades actually benefited a ton from 3D, and if I remember correctly, gaming experts, historians may weigh in here, but I'm pretty sure arcades were the driving force for 3D, right? Virtua Fighter was an arcade game, and I think a lot of arcade hardware, like Sega's Naomi hardware and stuff like that, like 3D was actually kind of a product of the arcades themselves. It wasn't, a console phenomenon that came to the arcade. It was actually the other way around. 3D came from arcades and was brought into consoles. So that also doesn't quite line up for me because, again, I think arcades benefited from 3D in a lot of ways and were sort of the genesis of it. And then home consoles caught up to it and we kind of associate it with home consoles. But I don't think it was a product of consoles killing. And again, remember, arcades for a long time were just way more powerful than home consoles. And so 3D was actually, again, a selling point to go to the arcade. Oh, your SNES can't handle, Tekken, you're in these types of things. Your N64 isn't playing these games. Even your PlayStation with Tekken 3 is good, but is it Tekken Tag? So stuff like that. I don't think 3D was the problem with the death of fighting games. And I think a lot of shmups and fighting games, and I think a lot of arcade genres actually made a surprisingly good transition into 3D. So the fourth suspect, this one is very interesting because I think it's a direct beneficiary of the change, but I don't think in itself this is a problem. So RPG. So putting all the dumb memes aside, were RPGs the death of the arcade? Were they the death of shmups? I think there's a lot of reasons why you could think this, a lot of interesting arguments. The first being that RPGs are just very, game design wise, very different from shmups, different from original arcade genres because of the way they work. They're not focusing on mastery based gameplay, they're more focused on storytelling and systems and stats and those types of turn based combat and all. That's all very opposed to the arcade genre. Also, remember, arcades are about compressing that game time in to get your quarters quickly and efficiently. Imagine putting an RPG in an arcade, like you got Final Fantasy and someone puts a credit in and it lasts for like 5 hours or whatever. Yeah, they're not compatible with the arcades. I think there's definitely that. And also RPGs are kind of I would say, a foundation where gaming went. A lot of gaming, like the modern gaming, you can tell like RPGs work their way into a lot of modern gaming concepts, right? Like the idea of level progression. You can find that in stuff that aren't necessarily RPGs. And a lot of the most popular genres now have tons of RPG elements, and it's always kind of like, I feel like RPGs are sort of like the chocolate of video games where you just kind of want to throw them in everything. Everything's kind of nice with an RPG attached to it. Like, oh, let's make a first-person shooter, but it's an RPG. Oh, let's make a racing game, but it's an RPG. That happens let's make a character action game, but it's an RPG, Dark Souls. So those types of things. I think RPGs are definitely a huge shift away, and I do think they, in some ways, have damaged the arcade genres because the way they have trained the audience to expect things. Like you can see many reviews where people will say, oh, Raiden 4, it's only 30 minutes long. Where's the value in that when I could buy The Witcher that's 1,000,000 hours long and never ends and has new level plus and all that sort of stuff. So I think RPGs, there is a lot of actual arguments for why RPGs could be damaging to people's expectations. But I think the thing about RPGs is that they directly benefit from the change, but they're not the change itself. They are just related to it. So I think it's close, but I don't think it's quite the issue. So then we get to the final one, and for a long time, I feel like you could have argued that this was the definitive answer: consoles, because of course there was nothing that competed more directly with arcades than home consoles. Home consoles are the reason why people stopped going to the arcade, because it isn't that people quit gaming, it's that they got those experiences within their home. It's just more economic, it's just more convenient, and also the target demographic for a lot of gamers at the time were, younger-ish boys that couldn't drive like myself. So as much as I even wanted to go to the arcade, I saw the value proposition of investing in the home console more as being much more worth my time. I was much more excited about home console releases because of that. Home consoles were just way more directly accessible to people, and that really laid into the profits for what arcades could manage. It also kind of tailored your expectations, made you a little bit more stingy, because like, oh, am I going to go to the arcade and spend $10 when I could go to the arcade, spend $3 and spend the rest of that money saving for a game? I did that myself. So in a lot of ways, I can see a ton of arguments for home consoles, and they're also a reason why arcades really struggle to return, which is like, why would you invest all this money in arcades when the home console market, or the PC market now, the home gaming content is just so much stronger, especially in the world right now where just outside the home businesses are struggling. It does even outside of gaming, like movie theaters, brick and mortar, mom and pop shops, all that sort of stuff just was really struggling in today's environment. So arcades are even that way. The problem though with home consoles is I think you could say the question, if home consoles didn't exist, would the arcade have been thriving? Would the arcade still exist? I guess in a way you could argue that, but it just feels to me that it is so inevitable that that a home console would come to exist. It's just the natural progression of things. It's so I guess you could say that is the answer, but I wanted to pin down a point on that, which is there is a world where the arcades and home consoles still could have coexisted had it been for what I am going to reveal as, I think, the true death of the arcade, the true killer of the arcade, the shift that caused the arcade to die. But anyway, let me get to this point. Think of early home consoles. So the NES, even the Super Nintendo kind of moves away from this. And early like PC, like those European PC consoles. And also think of the Neo Geo, right, which is literally an arcade at home. It could be argued, and this is why I'm not picking consoles, it could be argued that there could have been a system where they both were still in harmony. And I think that the idea would have been, you could have done the movie theater model, where the arcades were like movie theaters, where new games came to the arcade, and you'd go play them at the arcade for a year, and then they'd come out on console. Like a Neo Geo type situation or something like that. I don't know if that's how Neo Geo worked, but you could see that that kind of happened a little bit during like the Dreamcast era, the Saturn type of era, N64 a little bit, SNES and stuff. That stuff kind of happened, right? Where it would come to the arcades. Oh man, I really want to play the game, Tekken 4, but it's only an arcade. That actually happened with a Tekken 7, right? For a long time, it was only an arcade, and all these home console players or people in America were going crazy because they wanted to play it for so long. So that I feel like there could have been a model where arcades survived and remained relevant, because they could have been like the movie theater. We have the new releases, you have to come here to play the new releases, and then they come to your home consoles. But by the time that happens, we've got a new board, we've got a new arcade game, just like how theaters work, right? And they could have even kind of adapted this to be a little bit more of like a Neo Geo thing, where not every single game was its own board, but instead they could have had like, imagine like a PS4 arcade board, right? And they'd get the game and it'd be exclusive in the arcade, but it's just a disc on the arcade version, and then it gets ported to the home console versions. You see what I'm saying? So I think it could have worked. That could have existed, except for what I feel is the killing point for arcades. And this is, drum roll, I'm going to show the image on the screen for a sec. And you're probably wondering, what am I looking at here? So if my editing is correct, the image that you're going to be looking at this on the screen is a dual shot of some random game you've never heard of, Zork or whatever, and The Legend of Zelda. So what is the true killing point for the arcade? In my opinion, the true killing point is the introduction of the save game feature. And the reason for that is because until the save game feature was implemented into gaming as a concept, you had a different philosophy with game design. And so this divergence, I want to call it the progression-based philosophy and the mastery-based philosophy. So mastery-based philosophy is arcade games, is your shoot 'em ups, your beat 'em ups, your fighting games, where the goal, even Pac-Man, all that sort of stuff. The goal of this era of gaming was Tetris, I guess. I don't know about Tetris, but something like that. The goal of this era of the gaming was not to reach the end of the game, because most players would reach the end of the game in one sitting. The idea was, okay, you are going to sit down, you're going to reach the end of the game, or as far as you can get in the game in one sitting. Every gameplay experience depends on replayability. Replayability is absolutely critical to the game design. That is the foremost thought when you design this game. The game must be replayed. It must be able to be replayed over and over. And we need to create a reason for you to keep playing the game, to keep putting in quarters, to keep returning every single time, even though the game experience only lasts an hour, half hour, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever the game is. That is actually... So people say the biggest shift in game design was the introduction of 3D. Everyone, people like mainstream gaming YouTube always say, oh, the biggest shift was going from 2D to 3D. That was a radical change. And I remember that being a radical change myself. But I think the biggest shift in game design came way before that, which was the introduction of the save game feature. So Legend of Zelda was chosen because it was the first console game with the same game feature. And I believe this Zork game, from my own research, was the first game ever to have a save game feature. And I do want to point one thing out, because I can hear the keyboards already tapping away saying, wait a minute, what about passwords? What about passwords? The thing is that passwords were designed as a convenience, but they're not totally radically changing the way you design the game. For instance, like Mega Man or Ninja Gaiden and stuff like that. So you can still play and beat those games in one sitting, and it's still kind of the idea that you would sit and play those games in one sitting. The idea of the password system is like a little bit of a mercy for players to be like, okay, you've really put a lot of work in here, but you want to... It's like a stage select, basically. So the password system is like a stage select system. But you couldn't scale password systems into the future, into the complex change that we've seen today. So I think the biggest shift was introducing the save game feature, because that completely opened up and completely changed how game design worked. So again, mastery-based game design, the arcade genres and stuff that we love, it's all about creating a game that's infinitely replayable or extremely replayable, implementing systems to incentivize the player to return over and over. That's why we get scoring systems and stuff like that. Finding a way to also gauge mastery. That's very important, right? To distinguish skill between players. That is extremely important. But with the introduction of save games and stuff like that, we're now moving away from that concept completely and moving into what I call progression-based gameplay, which is how mainstream games work now, where the goal of the game is not to master it, is not to build a skill set, and it's not also to be extremely replayable. The goal of the game is to complete the game, is to get to the end. And so we're stretching out how the game design works. And instead of rewarding the player with sort of points or sort of indications like, the end screens and stuff like that of skill, we're not rewarding the player directly for their skill. Instead, we're rewarding the player with in-game incentives, right? So I think Super Metroid, stuff like that's a good example. Zelda, of course, perfect example. And then RPGs, right? Grinding, leveling, progressing. I think RPGs really benefit from this game design, but I think even if RPGs didn't exist, you'd still have this with stuff like first person shooters, like even Doom to some degree, even though you can sit and play Doom, Half-Life, something like that. But I think Metroid Prime again. So I think this was the killing point, the big shift that killed arcades, because this is what people expected. So it wasn't just that people didn't go to the arcades because they were expensive and you had to get out of your house, you have to beg your parents for quarters. It was also because what you were looking for was not being offered by the arcade anymore. The arcade felt antiquated. It felt like, oh, this is old game design. Whereas Legend of Zelda, Chrono Trigger, all this sort of thing is new game design. And so I think that is the shifting point, and the reason why arcades ultimately died is because not only were the way that they did business, not only was that antiquated, but I think in a lot of gamers' minds, myself included for a long time, the actual design of the games and the genres was antiquated, where you feel rewarded by the game with power-ups, with progression, and you'll actually hear this and see this a lot in people's comments and feedback on my channel. If you go through on these different shmup topic videos, people will say, oh, I like the game, but I think shmup should have more progression. I think they should reward you more, right? And you've seen shmups experiment with this, like Zero Ranger, where you gain weapons as you go. Console shmups, like on the Genesis, kind of experimented with this a lot. Thunder Force, for example, right, where you like gain power-ups as you go, and that's also interesting how, and it kind of supports my theory that console shmups were the first shmups to try this out, right? Whereas arcade shmups still mostly stuck to their guns, being more about the fundamental core shmupping game design, whereas console shmups started to add in more sort of progressive elements into it, right? Rather than mastery based. So that is my sort of theory on why the arcades died. But also, moving from that theory, I think there are some really interesting thoughts we can take away from this. The first being that I think there's been a dramatic shift in the gaming landscape again, and it is possible that because of the way technology works and because of the way online social interaction works, we can actually gain that the mastery-based game design could come back into favor, could come back into mainstream, like being much more accepted mainstream because of a few things. One is that, so think back in the past, like let's say you were really freaking good at Pac-Man. That didn't seem to have a whole lot of meaning, and a whole lot of, like, let's say you go to school, you'd be like, yeah, I don't know Pac-Man scores, right? So I got 50,000 in Pac-Man, and your friend's like, that's cool. And then your friend's talking about, oh, but in Pokemon, I caught a Charizard, and then I leveled up my Blastoise, and I think Mew is hidden underneath a truck, and all that sort of stuff. You know what I mean? There's more social interaction and more ways you can interact with each other in the past around this sort of progression-based game design. But now with the internet, people can, you can show your replay of you playing Pac-Man, and they'll be like, oh, okay, that comes back. The arcade experience can be more simulated now within the home, and I think that is what brought fighting games back first. So I think fighting games, we can look to fighting games as being the first step back in that, because fighting games were the first ones to really have online gameplay among the arcade genres that was meaningful, and that was kind of what brought arcades back, really, is Street Fighter 4 with its online gameplay having all the elements that people were looking for. And now with fighting games too, like imagine you release a fighting game. This still happens because the Japanese developers are behind the times, but let's say you release a fighting game with like no net play. I mean, at this point, would that even be a complete game? I mean, you could, and people could play it at their locals or whatever, but it just would be extremely confined by that factor. And what would probably happen is if it was a really good game like Melee, the community would just create net play for it. So I think it's just core fundamental. And I think moving forward with shmups, we need to keep that in mind where, okay, we need to create some more infrastructure for these. Again, I think this is why Toho was also so strong, because Toho had the replay sharing stuff, and that worked really well. Whereas arcade games with MAME and stuff, that kind of worked, but it wasn't as built in as Toho. So I think that's another reason why Toho thrived, is because you could share the replays online, and they're so easy to load up and watch. And I think Toho players still do that a lot, right? They still Like, I remember I was looking for some, like, a high score in Toho, and someone dropped me a replay file. I was like, really? There's not a video? So I think moving forward, I think it's a good sign that we could be coming back. Our shmups could be coming back into relevance more if we start taking advantage of the strengths of our genre. But this is going back to Philip's comment, is I would argue that I agree, because shmups could have moved into that more progression-based game design, you know, kind of, I think Euro shmups kind of tried to do this, right? But let's say shmups went all in on that and it worked out. I think they still would have lost, in some sense, their essence, which is the mastery-based game design. Maybe nowadays you have to kind of do both, right? You have to kind of meet people in the middle there. That could also be a thing to think about. But overall, that is my conclusion. I hope you all really enjoy this video. I'm going to have more follow-ups on that. Shout outs to everyone, and let me shout out my patrons. So shout out to Dingo, Handicapped, Anthony A, Ben Win, Borgie22, Choreo, Disco Star Slayer, Dominic, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Shmupper, Hausu, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malays, Mark Toms, Martin Worrell, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Okla Kugels, Philip, shoutouts for your comment, Ram Q, Raul, Smacky Factor, TRM, Sugumo, Plasmo, and Utsukaya. Thanks for watching.